Food production is the main driver of this land use change. It uses 40% of the world's ice-free surface, 70% of our water resources, and emits about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not surprising that agriculture alone is identified as a threat to more than 85% of species at risk of extinction. And all of this while the food system still fails to deliver the nutrition we need in an equitable, healthy, and sustainable way. But none of this really helps to answer the question, what is nature? In fact, this question is better phrased as what is nature to you? So over millennia and around the world, people have developed myriad ways of understanding and relating to nature. Our value perspective about nature depends on our worldviews, which may be human-centered or centered on living beings or ecological processes and functions more generally, or even without a single focus taking into account many interconnected and complex relationships. So this triangle represents a scenario set at the heart of these plural interpretations of positive futures for humans and in and with nature. It's an illustration of the Nature Futures framework, which was developed by the IPBES Task Force on Scenarios and Modelling to fill a gap in future scenarios. The climate community have the RCPs and the SSPs, which help us to project climate change, weather events, and socio-economic kind of pathways that go alongside those, but there isn't a consideration of future development pathways that put nature and preferences around it at the core. And that's a substantial omission really, given what we know about the connectedness between nature and humans, the economy, our health and well-being and more. So think of this triangle as representing the many positive value perspectives that exist for humans and nature. And we can use it as a lens through which to interpret current and planned actions for biodiversity and ecosystems. And this space is characterized by three kind of extreme value perspectives. They are nature for nature, which is the intrinsic value of nature, nature as having its own inherent worth, a value to itself that's independent of its direct contribution to society. On the left, we have nature as culture. This describes the kind of meaningful relationships and responsibilities in a more than human world. It helps us to consider the cultural, spiritual, and emotional bonds that we have with nature and the role of those relationships in shaping our identities and fostering communities and well-being. And then in the bottom right, we have nature for society, which is the utility of nature for human purposes. It's the benefits that nature can provide to us, like food, raw materials, and services like pollination and climate regulation. It sees nature as a resource to meet societal needs and to support economies. So while you're thinking about the answer to this question, what is nature to you? I'm going to give 3 examples of conservation actions and schemes that can help you locate yourself on this value space. So the first is the Virunga Massif Conservation Area. This is a transboundary collective of 3 national parks that sits across the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda. It's managed mainly for the globally important population of mountain gorillas, who are a keystone species, and this area has about 80% of the total global population. About 50,000 visitors a year, bringing about $200 million of tourism revenue, which is used to manage the park, to fund national government, and with about 20 or 30% of that revenue going to local communities. Both those communities are now largely excluded from the lands where they would have used in the past. So let's identify that on the NFF value space. So it's a transboundary effort. So it's more concerned with the ecological ranges than political boundaries. Management is for the benefit of a keystone species. So these 2 points put this case study in the NFM domain, nature for nature, as having its own inherent worth. But the area also attracts a lot of tourism because people want to see these animals and their habitats, and local people are now unable to access the lands where they were once able to, and in exchange for that, communities are paid. So these points together take us away from that nature as culture, relational corner, and a bit towards the NFS, the utility of nature for humans corner. Secondly, this is a more general case study about conservation led by Indigenous people and local communities who tend to have close connections with the land where they live and often have well-established systems of living in harmony with nature. Just under 40 million square kilometres across 87 countries, which is equivalent to about 25% of the world's land surface, is managed by or has rights assigned to Indigenous peoples. These cultural landscapes are often managed in ways that promote heterogeneity and biodiversity, with some traditionally managed landscapes having exceptionally high local diversity that outperforms other conserved lands. So in recognition of this, at a recent COP16, Canada announced it's going to provide $800 million of funding for Indigenous-led conservation programs at the centre of their area-based biodiversity conservation commitments. So back to the NFF triangle, we normally see that the transfer of rights and responsibilities of nature to Indigenous people and local community groups is of great benefit to biodiversity. So that takes us a bit towards the nature for nature corner. But under this type of management, there's usually a substantial relational component and a holistic approach with people integrated into the landscapes and the management of it. And they're also kind of remote lands. So this together puts this action in the nature's culture corner, but probably a bit towards the NFM value space. But what parts of nature or even our relationships with it can be valued in the dominant economic paradigm, which then gives us the opportunity to substitute the values that nature can bring us with other types of capital. This is what happens with voluntary carbon schemes, for example, and is possible with other types of nature benefits too. The RED Plus schemes operate under this value perspective. An example is the scheme being implemented in Indonesia since 2013. Over the period up to 2020, that scheme was responsible for annual emission reductions equivalent to about 40,000 flights between Edinburgh and New York. And of course has benefits for biodiversity and ecosystems more generally, as forest is protected from deforestation and degradation. And for these services, Indonesia received about more than $150 million, primarily from the Green Climate Fund, but also from bilateral agreement with Norway, as it invested to offset its national emissions. So of course, for this value space, we're starting firmly in the instrumental nature value corner. What can nature provide for humans? And it's kind of a way to offset our lifestyles, which is arguably part of our culture, or some people's culture. It may enable us to visit Runga or Coral Triangle and bring funds to those areas to protect nature there. These funding mechanisms can also be used to prioritise nature globally, i.e. through the bilateral agreements like that between Norway and Indonesia. So we go slightly towards the NFN corner for this one, but still firmly in that nature for society and instrumental value space. So we can map these conservation actions for different parts of this value space. And you can start to see how these value perspectives are expressed in practice and can affect choices around land use and land management in quite profound ways. And probably globally, the most important policy framework in this sphere is the coming onshore Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF. This was adopted in 2022 by 196 countries, including the UK, as a global strategy to address the worsening biodiversity crisis and widespread degradation of ecosystems. It comprises a vision of people living in harmony with nature by 2050, defined by goals to be achieved by 2050, targets to be implemented by 2030, and indicators to guide countries in making commitments towards positive futures for people and nature. And all of this was designed through an inclusive and iterative process involving diverse set of stakeholders. So the 23 targets of the GBF are grouped as reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. Target 3 is probably the most talked about of all the targets. This is to protect 30% of nature by 2030, which has become known as 30 by 30. Many of you might be aware of it already. It defines the conservation and management of protected areas, including, if appropriate, any sustainable use. As with many targets, they're quite verbose and broad. For example, many don't even contain this kind of quantitative commitment, and hence they can lead to very different interpretations depending on your value perspective. So this map shows the global spatial distribution of protected areas and conserved lands from 2019. So that's about 17 or 18% of the terrestrial land surface. This map's on half a degree grid, which is about 50 square kilometers per cell, and the intensity of the color in that cell represents the amount proportion of land in that cell that's protected. So the deeper, more intense reds are areas of quite high protection. So you can see kind of the Amazon there in South America. So some colleagues at UNEP WCMC, they recently did some global spatial prioritizations based on the 3 extreme value perspectives of the NFFs. So specifically thinking about this 30 by 30 target. So for nature, the model prioritized key biodiversity areas, IUCN species richness, and Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. It doesn't respect existing protected areas or other conserved lands because they're not always optimal for biodiversity anyway. And that is kind of what 30 by 30 could look like from a nature value perspective lens. For nature as culture, the priority is for indigenous and community lands and culturally significant species ranges, while respecting and expanding on existing OECMs, which are other effective conservation measures. These are areas where the secondary purpose of the use of that land is for conservation. So like, for example, in this case, indigenous lands, primary purpose is not conservation, that's just a secondary incidental benefit for that land. So the OECM lands in this case are locked in. So for nature for society, the priorities are for nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services, like recreation and nature access, timber, flood mitigation, grazing and pollination, and more, all of which are prioritised by country, along with the global prioritisation of vulnerable carbon. In this case, protected areas are locked in because these areas often have value related to tourism and recreation and productive uses like agriculture. So 30 by 30 in that case looks like this. So I understand that some of you may take issue with some of these maps. For example, nature for nature has an obvious equatorial bias. For nature, nature for nature has an equatorial bias. Nature as culture may have too much of a focus on indigenous people, local communities, while ignoring relational nature benefits for other groups. And the nature for society map may miss certain NCPs, but anyway, you can see that a very different picture emerges from these 3 interpretations of the same 30 by 30 target. And that's just one target. Like I said, there's 23 of them, so the implementation of all of these targets differs depending on one's value perspective. Then we can see a very different pathway or pathways emerging to meet the same targets. So part of the work we've been doing recently is to interpret these targets through the lens of the NFFs, the NFF perspectives, to give a common scenario set for monitoring and evaluating strategies and actions in a similar way to what the SSPs and RCPs do for the climate community. We've done this in collaboration with the Natural History Museum, UNEP WCMC, CEH, under the guidance of IPBES Task Force on Scenarios and Modelling, with funding from DEFRA. So thinking about the GBF targets in this way is useful because we can also start to identify drivers other than area-based protection measures and build more detailed scenarios around that in order to model scenarios and outcomes in the future. So I've already discussed how protected areas may differ between the scenarios according to target 3. Target 1 is about planning and managing all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. So we might think about how the management intensities inside and outside of protected areas may differ between the scenarios. So in nature for nature, do we kind of intensify production, free up as much land as possible for nature in a kind of land sparing approach? Whereas in nature as culture, does that mean getting multiple outcomes delivered from the land, including the integration of people into it? So we are allowed productive uses of national parks, etc., and protected areas. For target 18, this is about reducing harmful incentives and subsidies. But what does that mean for agricultural inputs like fertilizer and water resources, and also transport costs and trade barriers and costs associated with that? The targets that concern technology, how the rate and uptake of technology differ between scenarios. We can think of the nature as culture world being more decentralized. So would that affect the rate and uptake of technology in that situation compared to more centralized focus? And for target 16, which is to enable sustainable consumption, what might happen to dietary preferences in this case? Should we expect to see more traditional alternatives, for example, to animal source foods in nature as culture, like tofu and falafel, or in nature for society or nature for nature? Do we expect more tech-based and novel solutions like cultured meats and those kind of alternatives? And where would all these changes start to occur, and how would they be brought in? So all of these variables relate to different GBF targets and will vary based on their interpretation, just like the spatial prioritization varies. And we're in a process of building these scenarios to model these alternative futures and explore lots of outcome indicators related to land use and land management, biodiversity and NCPs, socioeconomics, including the affordability of food, and even dietary health and non-communicable diseases. And all of this will give us a comprehensive picture of what these alternative futures might actually have in store for people and nature, and any trade-offs that we might see. And I've got a couple of examples of those trade-offs and results from the modelling work that we've started. So these maps are the output of a global spatially resolved land use model ensemble called LandSim. It accounts for links between climate change, food demand preferences, regulation and prices around inputs, technology development, and lots of other things that allow us to explore scenarios that we've based on the NFF interpretations of the GBFs. So you can see here the differences in land cover between the nature for nature world and the nature as culture world, the flipping between them. And we've parameterized these scenarios based on the spatial distribution of protected areas and across a land spare and a land sharing continuum. So in nature for nature, protected areas don't allow any use, whereas in nature as culture, there's some use or low input intensities that are permitted. And based on these parameterizations, the model then decides how to allocate land cover and land use and how that will change over time, in this case by 2050. So these maps show the majority of land cover in each grid cell. So some of the comparison is lost because in each cell there's many things happening. There's things like cropland, pasture, other natural areas, different types of timber and urban areas. But these maps are only concerned with whatever takes up the most space. So cropland is a majority land cover, like in this example grid cell, and that's all the model is showing. But you can clearly see agriculture getting kicked out of South America, and differences in forest composition for Southeast Asia, amongst other differences that you might spot. And if you think back to the spatial prioritization maps from earlier, you might remember large areas of South America being protected in the NFN scenario, which is also the scenario with strict protection inside protected areas. So you can clearly see that agriculture get productive uses being kicked out there. And of course, we expect that the differences in land cover that we're seeing between these scenarios will have a big impact on biodiversity and ecosystem processes and functions. But that's work that we're planning to do in future. We haven't got to that part of the analysis yet. What we have done is to also look at food prices across time. So just showed a comparison between the nature for nature and nature for society this time. Results. These plots show the spares index, which basically gives the price of a basket of goods across time from the starting point of the model into the future, in this case, up to 2060. In the nature for nature scenario on the left, we can see quite a substantial price spike up to 20% before decreasing as the model settles and productive land is reallocated away from protected areas. Remember, in this version, any agriculture is kicked out of protected land at the same time as the coverage of protected areas increases. So there's a lot happening that underpins this behaviour in the model. Meanwhile, in Nature for Society, there are only softer limits on management intensities, so the change is less severe, with slight price increases in most global regions before a decline in prices that reflects improvements in technology, amongst other things. From this, we can also explore how changes in food prices, along with changing preferences for food, affect actual consumption, and in turn, how this will change BMI and the resultant risk of non-communicable diseases and even dietary-related mortality. So we can build quite a detailed picture with this and other metrics about the nuance and outcomes across different human and nature metrics that can help policymakers understand the implications of implementing targets that are aligned with one value perspective or another. Of course, the reality is that for many of us, our value perspective is somewhere in between these extremes. So in the real world, these value perspectives are more balanced as we try to find an acceptable path. And this is the kind of ultimate purpose of democratic decision-making processes like that of the CBD and agreement on the GBF targets, which entail weighing conflicting values and interests and purposes of a diverse set of stakeholders. So we have to be realistic about what can be achieved and in what time frame. So, for example, with the Nature for Nature spatial prioritization at the top, it's very unlikely, really, that successful global governance and cooperation will lead to a complete spatial reallocation of protected areas that is globally optimized for nature's benefit by 2030, and in which case, kind of what would South American countries think about that? What's more likely is that the political boundaries will be respected and countries will be expected to protect 30% of their own land, which could again lead to quite a different picture demonstrated here with another spatial prioritization by UNEP WCMC. In this case, it optimizes on the same NFM and nature layers, so the key biodiversity areas, those things, but with 30% protection by country rather than globally. So modelling will require exploration of the space between the extreme scenarios to kind of maximise the relevance of the work to policymakers. And that's kind of how I'm going to leave it today, that diverse value perspectives, people and nature can lead to very different policy pathways. But because many parties to the GBF lack capacity for monitoring and evaluation of biodiversity targets because of the comprehensive monitoring costs, even though there's a kind of financial support mechanism of the CBD to help countries implement GBFs, monitoring is still prohibitively expensive for many. And also because the GBF targets involve multiple sectors like trade, finance, consumption, land use, lots of others that interact in complex ways and cannot be completely covered even by the indicators recommended as part of the GBF reporting framework. So in that case, narratives and modelling, like what I presented here today, help plug these gaps and serve as a proxy and enable sensitivity analysis for plausible development pathways against a range of societal outcomes, including biodiversity and economics. And this remains our best and only real option to comprehensively evaluate alternative futures for people and nature, even though lots of work remains to fully consider the diversity of nature values and practice. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. Really nice to be here. So to meet everyone. So yeah, just briefly about me. So I've had a bit of a kind of windy career, like so many people in this field. I started off in psychology a long time ago, but food and kind of why we eat what we eat has been kind of the only red thread in my career. But now I mostly work on kind of policy and politics and kind of particularly corporate power and influence within that. Well, my corporate power today. So in terms of the outline, I'm going to sort of aim for today is essentially just to kind of give you, to get you thinking about corporate power in your work on food systems. Just to kind of, I'm not going to give you any big answers on what corporate power done or what hasn't it done. This is mostly just to get you, give you some examples and illustrate how it manifests in food policy and kind of, you know, how you might be able to kind of, how we navigate food policy in a way that's really sensitized to corporate power, essentially. So I'm going to give you a very brief intro to kind of why we should care about corporate power and how it manifests in our food system, particularly focusing on kind of how it shapes policy and governance. So obviously it shapes a lot of different parts of life, but I'm focusing on policy making because that's what I work on mostly. And then I'm going to illustrate some of the ways in which that happens using animal agriculture and the issue of meat consumption in the context of climate change as an example. I'm doing that because that's actually what my current fellowship project is looking at. So I'm kind of looking at why meat consumption remains so marginal in global food and climate governance, even though it's a really obvious target if we want to reduce food-related climate impacts. And corporate power is one part of the puzzle here. And so because I've been thinking about meat and I've been thinking about power, that's why I'm using that as an example today. But it's obviously a lot broader. Right. And also just to acknowledge my fellowship is funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Right, so why does corporate power matter? So we could spend days talking about power in the food system. I'm focusing on corporate power today because corporations have become a lot more important in our lives over the last couple of decades. There's been a lot more large corporations have grown in size since the 70s, 80s, and they've become a lot more significant in our economies, in politics, and in our daily lives generally. And I think that's why it's really important that we talk about corporate power. These are just a couple of clippings from the past week or two that I found that just kind of illustrate the way in which corporate power really permeates, policy and politics. So there's one example about advertising. In the context of the advertising rules that have come in, they're coming in the UK. There's one about price. You can see at the bottom. Can you see that when I move my? Yeah. Okay. What about price? And then there's this really striking example of the biggest meat company, JBS, being the largest donor to Trump's inauguration through its an American subsidiary, and then just one day later, there's a news clipping essentially showing that. Announcing that the SEC has greenlighted their IPO to the New York Stock Exchange after years and years of the company trying to get there, and about they had fines for bribery and corruption, and then suddenly it's happened as of 2 days ago or 1 day ago. So yeah, that's just one striking example of kind of how this kind of power is exerted, because kind of when we think about food and farming, we often think about the people that grow our food, the people that prepare our food, but actually, what's easy to forget is that's also really big business, and kind of that's why we're talking about this today. So this is, when we think about the forms of power and the way in which power is exercised in policy and politics in particular, this is one potential framework. So there's loads of them, but this is one I think does a really good job at illustrating the kind of different dimensions of power at play. It's one by Jennifer Clapp and Doris Fuchs, who basically illustrate this kind of interconnection between instrumental, structural, and discursive power. That companies essentially utilize to kind of sustain their market position and legitimacy in the face of challenges. And in our case, what we're interested in today, these challenges are essentially public concern about environmental impacts, health impacts, and growing regulatory pressure in that context. So we have firstly instrumental power. That's the most obvious visible type of power. So instrumental power might look like lobbying or kind of participation in expert committees or kind of campaign contributions, as you saw on the last slide. And that's a very kind of a much more concrete influencing of outcomes and one actor kind of exerting power over another. And that's something that actually, it's badly documented and it's kind of hard to get the data, but it's still something that we can observe quite neatly. Secondly, structural power. So that's a bit more hidden. Structural power is kind of referring to the less visible ways in which kind of corporations can shape policy and politics. And that's often, when we're thinking about this, it's often kind of determining what's on the table, which solutions are on the table, which problems we're addressing before the process of bargaining or policymaking even starts. That's very much kind of shaping, shaping the agenda, shaping what's possible, shaping what's considered acceptable, feasible. And that's a really, really, really important dimension of power. And a lot of that stems from the privileged position that business holds in society, and because of their contribution to economic growth, and because states are really dependent on private sector profitability, and that lends them the structural power that other actors don't have. So the way that can manifest is it can manifest kind of almost automatically. So, you know, and in a sense that policymakers might be predisposed to make decisions that align with corporate interests. I've seen a lot of that in the kind of global context where member states might actually intervene in a way that protects their domestic industry. And we're going to have one example for that later on. But essentially where that intervention happens without a direct kind of involvement of, you know, any companies, but where there's just this intuitive kind of protection of a domestic sector. But it might also be used, so structural power can also be used a lot more strategically. So that's where we're thinking, for example, about very direct threats to relocate or disinvest to influence policy making. So where essentially companies that have a lot of investment in the country or have the potential to invest in a country have essentially the ability to punish or reward local countries. And then last but not least, in terms of structural power, companies have also become direct providers of governance increasingly through private regulation or kind of policy standards or corporate social responsibility. So in a way that kind of replaces public regulation. Think about, for example, voluntary labeling standards, kind of, you know, sustainable fisheries labeling, for example, those kind of things. And so sorry, let's just remember that this. But one example for this essentially, for sustainable development, they've been really instrumental in at the global level pushing for private regulation, which can have an impact. But the issue comes where that replaces government action. And then last but not least, power is also a really important function of norms and ideas, and reflected in discourse, kind of communicative practice, and cultural values and institutions. So that's where discursive power is exercised through, for example, public relations or advertising in a way that shapes the contours of public and political discussion. And that includes, for example, narratives and frames that organize and make sense of reality by attaching specific meanings to a particular problem definition or envision solutions, kind of real or potential solutions. There's one example here I wanted to show you. I'm sure you've all seen the tailored caps that came in a couple of years ago. That's one app where Coca-Cola makes it look like they did this voluntarily, but actually it came in through EU legislation. And I thought that's a really interesting kind of reframing as, you know, as almost kind of sustainability action by Coca-Cola, but it's not voluntary. So that's just kind of one example of reframing kind of different actions. But the whole thing is a lot broader. So and like in terms of, in that context of framing and discursive power, was also really important to note is that that really heavily links to existing norms and values. So, you know, norms like freedom or, you know, increasingly sustainability, because people care about sustainability. So kind of linking things to those existing values in society is a really powerful way of kind of exerting power. Before we get to kind of meat consumption as a case study, also just to kind of really think about it's really important to think about the material underpinnings of corporate power. And I won't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but I would recommend that you engage with Jennifer Clapp's work if you're interested in this. She's done amazing work on corporate power from a markets perspective. But this is essentially just to recognize that so since the 70s, we've seen a huge increase in multinational corporations that kind of operate across borders. And that's a whole, you know, it's a whole new class of company essentially. And what we've seen in that time is essentially a concentration of sectors. So through kind of vertical integration and horizontal integration, you know, of sectors and whole supply chains, what happens in our food system is become increasingly concentrated and increasingly dominated by a shrinking number of companies. So what you can see here, for example, in agrochemicals, the top 6 firms control 78% of the market. That is hugely concentrated. You know, and even where it's just kind of 10 or 11%, you know, and that varies regionally, obviously. But what we see essentially, you know, if those companies have so much dominance in the market, they're not only able to shape prices and market structures, but they're also more able to shape politics and governance. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important to think about market concentration, market power, also in the context of what that means for politics. But yeah, if you're interested, Jennifer Clapp does a much better job of explaining this. Right. Let's get to the case study for today. So I'm going to be talking about meat consumption and the challenge of reducing food systems emissions. I won't have time to go into all of the detail and complexity here, but we can discuss that later if you want to. But essentially, the reason I'm focusing on meat consumption in particular is because food systems emissions are obviously really significant in the grand scheme of things. It's about 1/3 of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock is a huge part of this. So livestock accounts for over half of food-related emissions, approximately 14% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And that comes from enteric fermentation of ruminant livestock, manure, fertilizer used in feed production. That's really important to consider because a lot of the discussion is about methane that comes from cows and sheep, but also there are discussions that are going on about meat consumption more generally because feed production is also a huge source of emissions, and particularly the land use change that's associated with this. So essentially, the main takeaway is that, essentially, that what we eat really matters. So beef requires about 20 times more land and emits 20%, 20 times more greenhouse gas emissions than kind of comparable edible proteins from plant sources. So that's why essentially the kind of current rising meat consumption rates are not compatible with limiting global warming to 2%. And it's really important to kind of, so essentially there's a lot of consensus about the fact that a just transition requires reducing animal source food consumption in high consuming countries. There's a lot of discussion about what that will look like and how we do this, but current consumption rates in countries like the UK and the US and Canada, Australia in particular, are not sustainable, particularly because we're seeing rises in other regions where it actually might still contribute to kind of food security and where it's a lot more important from that regard. But and there's obviously also health reasons for reducing this. But long story short, just the foundation for this is essentially there's a growing consensus that we need to reduce meat consumption in the global north in particular, but it's still, particularly in global governance, really, really marginal in discussions about kind of climate change and about global food systems governance. It's a really, really tricky topic politically, and kind of what I'm going to be talking about today is just some of the ways in which kind of corporate power has contributed to this, and some of the kind of just illustrating some of the ways in which the industry has been countering this growing concern. Before we get to that briefly, also kind of what does just to illustrate what the kind of meat industry looks like. So we have obviously over a huge amount of people keeping livestock, and we have a huge amount of people eating meat, where we have the concentration is in the middle. So particularly slaughter and meat processing is increasingly concentrated, particularly in regions like the US, where we have 4 companies processing 80% of the cattle market. And here's an overview of some of the large kind of meat and dairy companies. This includes dairy, but this is some of the largest meat and dairy companies, and you'll be familiar with some of the names, but not all of them. Just as an example, so one, JBS is the biggest meat company globally, and some of the brands they own in the UK include Richmond, for example, or Rollover, the hot dogs. So it's this kind of really interesting trade-off between there being like a huge amount of farmers working in industry, but also this huge concentration in the middle where processing happens, where value is added. And similarly in animal pharmaceuticals, feed, and farm machinery. Right. So some examples for kind of how power is exerted in this space. So one thing corporate actors benefit from and kind of reinforce in the space are the kind of cultural norms which center meat in countries where meat is a really core part of diets. And again, I know kind of cultural norms are separately important, but it's really interesting to kind of consider how the industry is playing into this. These are some campaigns that have specifically kind of emerged in the context of there being more concern about climate impacts and health impacts. So one example is the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board campaign called Let's Eat Balanced, that initially started off in parallel to Veganuary, where this is always couched in the context of, we need to align adhere to dietary guidance, etc. And this is about choosing better options. But essentially, those others kind of display they're adverts for meat essentially, and they display meals that include meat. They don't display anything else. So it's just kind of important to consider that. Similarly, the Become a Beefitarian campaign that was European Union funded That was from a Spanish meat industry association, and they were publicly funded by the European Union through the Common Agricultural Policy Promotional Budget. And similarly, the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, they kind of, they benefit from the structural power of the sector in that this is something that public funding goes to because it's about promoting agricultural produce, but kind of health and climate consideration haven't quite found their way into those into the ways this money is distributed yet. So that's kind of why we end up with those kind of campaigns. Similarly, another interesting phenomenon that I've come across that is kind of also kind of amplifying the kind of discursive power, kind of amplifying this messaging by using trusted messages, are campaigns to kind of mobilize citizen and farmer advocacy in defense of beef. And this is, I think, quite a North American phenomenon. I'd be interested to see if anyone's seen this in Europe. But these are two campaigns, they're online courses essentially for farmers that are run by the Canadian Cattle Association, for the one on the left, and then by the National Cattle and Beef Association on the right. And there's a Good Guardian article about the Masters of Beef Advocacy as well. But essentially what they do is they teach farmers and citizens or anyone who wants to enroll in these courses to defend beef. And this is very, very much kind of couched in language around making people feel comfortable about eating beef again in a context where there's a lot of concern about climate impacts. So some of this messaging, is about the value of farming, but some of this messaging is also really explicitly countering climate science and countering kind of what we know about the health impacts of meat as well. So I think these are quite interesting. And if someone could do research on the content of it, I think that'd be really, really interesting. What is also really important in the narrative, so a lot of this, there's not really a lot of climate denial in this space, but there's a lot of kind of reframing and reconstructing, and I think this idea of green beef is really important here. So kind of what scientists kind of would agree on, I think a lot of kind of mainstream scientists working in the space, is that it's possible to kind of reduce emissions intensity of meat production through, all sorts of kind of changes in farming practices, feed additives, kind of breeding, changes to breeding, but it will always be a resource-intensive product. And, a lot of these changes in emissions intensity come with trade-offs. So what we see in the space, in terms of what's coming from the industry, is this kind of reframing, we can just make it a little bit more green, and then we don't have to do any reduction. So it's this kind of sustainable intensification narrative that's as long as we make it a little bit more efficient and we make it a little bit less emissions intensive, we can keep growing the industry. So this is not a less and better narrative in most cases. This is a just better, but we're going to keep increasing production. And I think that's where the issue comes in terms of climate governance, that a lot of these narratives are replacing discussions about reducing production and consumption. So there's one example here, braised beef. I think that's off the market now, but this is a product by Tyson where they were advertising essentially, this is better for the planet. Again, this is really appealing to consumers that are concerned about climate impacts. And it's kind of making people feel good about eating something that is quite high in emissions. And then similarly, I think discussions around regenerative agriculture, the kind of idea of regenerative agriculture comes in really heavily here, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but essentially it's a kind of fuzzily defined term that describes methods of farming that are about regeneration, about kind of restoring soil carbon, and there's a lot of discussions around regenerative grazing and how that can help restore soil carbon. But again, it's the same kind of co-optation of this narrative in a way that is like, we can just keep producing more and more and more. Even though that's hugely issues around land use, because it requires a lot of land to do regenerative grazing. So it's not the kind of less and better, it's just, we're going to do this. And companies like Nestle have invested huge amounts of kind of PR capital in kind of promoting their investment in regenerative farming as part of their kind of climate pledge. But it's quite fuzzy, and a lot of these commitments are really kind of unclear if they're going to do anything. Last but not least, some of you might have seen this. This came out about 2 weeks ago. So when the Heat Lancet report came out in 2019, there was a huge amount of backlash against it. The Heat Lancet report is essentially a flexitarian diet. It was criticized from all sides when it came out. Some people say it's too much meat, some people say it's too little meat, but essentially what's recommending is a reduction of meat consumption in meat dairy consumption in places where it's really high at the moment, and actually increases in some other places where it can contribute to food security and nutrition. So, it's essentially a flexitarian diet. It was an academic report supported by foundations, so it wasn't policy in any way, but the backlash at the time was really intense and huge. And what recently came out, we were reporting by Beesmog and The Guardian, is that essentially a PR firm called Red Flag, which is a PR firm known to do reputation and crisis management, including for tobacco. They've worked for Monsanto when pesticides were becoming an issue, that they were involved in the backlash, on behalf of a group called the Animal Agriculture Alliance, and they helped to orchestrate this and kind of essentially amplify the backlash against the report when it came out. This adds to something we've known for longer. So when it came out initially, the WHO, World Health Organization, had to pull out of the Geneva launch because the Italian government was really, really angry about WHO's involvement. They essentially said this is really inappropriate. This is, it was, I'm not quoting, but something about basically this being like vegan extremism. And they managed to successfully pressure the WHO into withdrawing their involvement from the launch. Which again kind of illustrates the kind of automatic structural power coming out, because essentially they went to kind of Italy exports a lot of meat products, processed meat products, so they were essentially this is not okay. So they kind of went to kind of protect their domestic sector, domestic industry, immediately and really aggressively. So this is just, I think, one example that illustrates really well how when the backlash is so aggressive and so loud, the issue of meat reduction becomes politically really hard to touch, and you can tell decision makers responding to that in a way that they know if they're going to touch this, it's going to be bad. Examples are also, for example, I think one of a US government agency years and years ago tried to introduce a Meatless Monday campaign just internally. The backlash was so big they dropped it immediately. They had to issue a whole statement saying, "Oh, we never wanted to do this. It's inappropriate." So it's just kind of, I think, and I know some of this backlash will be organic, but this was not the extent of this was not completely organic. So I think it's really important to kind of consider how strategic exertional power comes into this and how it makes those issues a lot harder to navigate. Some takeaways, reflections. So actually one thing that I will be thinking about over the coming months and years is the role of farmers and ranchers in this whole discussion. And I know all of you might be working on this more directly, but navigating the kind of political representation of animal agriculture really struck me that it's really heavily leveraged. It leverages the cultural significance of farmers and ranchers a lot. So we have a lot of those kind of ranching associations, like the National Cattle Ranchers Association in America, for example. They have involvement by huge meat processing firms, by animal feed firms. They have corporate partners, but they're really obscure. It's not clear when you look at our website that they have JBS as a partner. But they do they represent views that really align with the kind of larger corporate views within the sector. But it looks like it's just farmers. But then on the other hand, you do actually get organizations where, they are just farmers. But I find what I found, for example, in the context of European Union discussions, that the really large associations that include corporate partners have a lot more voice and a lot noisier and louder. And that's the people that, rocked up outside the European Parliament with the tractors. But there's other smaller groups that have less of a voice that are actually really supportive of climate action. And there might be others that are not supportive of climate action. But what I'm trying to do is handle essentially where the role of kind of corporate power comes into this and to what extent it actually comes in, because it's quite hard to kind of tell actually where this is coming from. Are they amplifying the voice, or are they actually distorting the voice of farming? So I think that's one thing I'll be grappling a bit more over upcoming years. And then just as a kind of takeaway, if you're working on food politics, it's really important to know not just what's said and whose voices are represented in discussion, but also who are remains silent, what's unsaid, what's missing that should be there, who's missing that should be there. And then finally, just kind of what in terms of food systems transformation, it's really important that we problematize corporate power. Corporate power doesn't have to be bad. Corporate concentration has some benefits for, you know, economies of scale, etc. But it's really important that we make it an issue that's talked about and discussed, and kind of that we make the implications visible. Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.